December 19, 1941. Adolf Hitler signed an order that made him supreme commander of the German armed forces. Not just politically, but operationally. He would now direct military operations personally, overriding the professional officer corps that had built Germany's early victories. At the time, the decision seemed necessary. The Soviet winter offensive had shattered German lines. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch had suffered a heart attack. Someone had to take command. But what began as an emergency measure became permanent policy. Within 18 months, the German military command structure had fractured into competing factions, paralyzed decision-making, and strategic incoherence. Professional military planning was replaced by political interference at every level. The army that conquered France in 6 weeks would spend the rest of the war fighting itself as much as the enemy. This was not a single decision but a cascade of choices that destroyed German military effectiveness from within. Hitler did not just take command. He systematically dismantled the institutional structures that had made German military success possible. Officers who disagreed were dismissed. Planning that contradicted his intuition was rejected. Alternative command structures emerged to bypass professional military channels. By 1944, Germany had multiple competing command hierarchies answering to different masters, unable to coordinate strategy, unwilling to share information, and incapable of adapting to battlefield reality. The collapse was political before it became military. Germany lost the war not primarily because of enemy superiority, but because its own command structure consumed itself. The decision to centralize all authority in Hitler's hands eliminated the flexibility, professional judgment, and institutional knowledge that armies require to function. What followed was a case study in how political interference destroys military effectiveness even when individual soldiers remain capable and committed. Before 1941, German military command functioned through a proven institutional structure. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, coordinated overall strategy. The Oberkommando des Heers, the Army High Command, handled operational planning. Professional officers with decades of training made tactical decisions. This system had roots in Prussian military tradition stretching back a century. It emphasized decentralized execution, mission-type orders, and commander initiative at every level. Junior officers were trained to understand intent and adapt plans to circumstances. Senior officers provided strategic guidance but trusted subordinates to execute. The system was not perfect, but it was effective. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The early Soviet campaign achieved stunning tactical victories. German military success from 1939 to 1941 was built on this professional, institutional approach to command. The structure included checks against political interference. Military professionals controlled operational decisions. Strategic planning was based on logistical reality and intelligence analysis, not ideological preference. When Hitler suggested operationally questionable moves in France, professional officers successfully modified the plans while maintaining his overall political intent. The balance was delicate but functional. Political leadership set strategic goals. Military professionals determined how to achieve them. The arrangement allowed Germany to leverage its military excellence while pursuing Hitler's political objectives. This system also contained mechanisms for debate and revision. Staff officers challenged assumptions. War games tested plans against realistic scenarios. Intelligence was evaluated by professionals trained to assess accuracy. Alternative strategies were discussed before final decisions were made. The German General Staff tradition valued thorough analysis and intellectual rigor. Officers were expected to speak honestly about operational limitations. This culture of professional military thinking was Germany's greatest military asset in the early war. It would not survive Hitler's assumption of direct command. Within Nazi Germany, power was always fractured. Hitler ruled through competing power centers that checked each other while ensuring no single institution could challenge him. The Wehrmacht answered to military tradition and professional standards. The SS answered to Heinrich Himmler and party ideology. The party apparatus had its own hierarchy. Regional Gauleiters wielded local authority. Economic ministries competed for resources. This fragmentation was intentional. It prevented any single organization from accumulating enough power to threaten Hitler's position. But it also made coordinated national policy nearly impossible. Each organization pursued its own agenda, competed for Hitler's favor, and undermined rivals. The military initially remained somewhat insulated from this political chaos. Professional officers maintained institutional independence through tradition and technical expertise. Hitler, who lacked military training, initially deferred to their judgment on operational matters. He set strategic objectives. They determined execution. But this arrangement depended on success. As long as victories continued, Hitler accepted professional military advice. When Operation Barbarossa stalled outside Moscow in December 1941, that deference ended. Hitler blamed military leadership for failure. The officer corps, he decided, lacked the will and vision to win total war. He would provide that will personally. The political environment made resistance to Hitler's takeover nearly impossible. Officers who objected could be accused of defeatism. Professional military advice could be dismissed as cowardice or lack of National Socialist spirit. The SS and party apparatus were eager to see Wehrmacht influence reduced. They supported Hitler's increased control because it weakened their institutional rivals. When Hitler announced he would assume direct command, there was no organized opposition. Individual officers had private doubts. Institutionally, the Wehrmacht had no mechanism to resist. The political structure of Nazi Germany ensured that Hitler's decision would be implemented regardless of its military wisdom. Hitler's assumption of direct military command was formalized on December 19, 1941, but the psychological decision came earlier. In October and November, as German forces stalled before Moscow, Hitler became convinced that his generals lacked the will to victory. They spoke of logistics, weather, and exhausted troops. Hitler saw these as excuses. He believed that willpower and fanatical determination could overcome material limitations. When generals recommended withdrawals to consolidate defenses, Hitler interpreted this as defeatism. He concluded that Germany needed a commander who understood the National Socialist spirit, who would never accept retreat, who would impose total commitment on the military. He would be that commander. The practical trigger was Field Marshal von Brauchich's collapse. On December 7, 1941, Brauchitsch suffered a severe heart attack. He had already lost Hitler's confidence during the Moscow stalemate. Hitler refused to appoint a replacement. Instead, he announced he would personally assume the duties of Commander-in-Chief of the Army. The decision was presented as temporary, an emergency measure during crisis. But Hitler had no intention of relinquishing the authority. He had discovered that direct command gave him complete control over military operations. No longer would he need to persuade professional officers. He would simply order. Disagreement would be insubordination. The justification offered publicly was that only Hitler understood the total nature of the war Germany was fighting. Professional soldiers, he claimed, fought in conventional military terms. This war required ideological commitment and ruthless determination that only he possessed. His generals had been trained in outdated concepts. He would bring revolutionary thinking to military command. This reasoning appealed to Nazi Party officials who had always resented Wehrmacht independence. It also created a framework where questioning Hitler's military decisions became equivalent to questioning National Socialism itself. The decision to assume command was rationalized as political necessity. In reality, it was the beginning of institutional collapse. Professional military officers immediately recognized the danger. Generals who had built their careers on systematic planning understood that one man, no matter how intelligent, could not effectively command operations across a continent. Military command required processing vast amounts of information, understanding complex logistics, coordinating between units, and adapting to rapid changes. The German general staff system existed precisely because modern warfare was too complex for individual command. Multiple senior officers privately warned that centralized command would create bottlenecks in decision-making. Their concerns were noted and ignored. Hitler was convinced his willpower would compensate for any structural inefficiencies. Field commanders closest to combat operations were particularly alarmed. They understood that battlefield situations required immediate decisions based on local knowledge. Referring every significant choice to Hitler's headquarters would paralyze operational flexibility. The concept of mission-type orders, where junior officers had authority to adapt plans to circumstances, would die if every decision required approval from Berlin or the Wolf's Lair. Some generals attempted to explain this to Hitler through formal channels. They emphasized that they were not questioning his strategic vision, only noting that operational effectiveness required delegation of tactical authority. Hitler interpreted these warnings as challenges to his judgment. He began noting which officers were resistant. Intelligence officers also raised concerns, though more quietly. They understood that Hitler's tendency to reject unwelcome information would worsen if he held direct command responsibility. Previously, professional staff could present unpleasant intelligence assessments with some institutional protection. Under direct Hitler command, intelligence that contradicted his operational plans might be suppressed before it reached decision-makers. Several intelligence officers documented their concerns in private correspondence. They predicted accurately that Hitler's command would create an information bubble where only confirming data reached the top. By late December 1941, these warnings were circulating among senior officers. None were formally presented to Hitler. The officers who understood the danger also understood they had no power to prevent it. The first test of Hitler's new command authority came immediately. In December 1941, Soviet counteroffensives were driving German forces back from Moscow. Field commanders requested permission to withdraw to defensible positions rather than hold exposed salients. Hitler refused. He issued his famous stand fast order. No retreats without his personal authorization. Officers who disobeyed would be dismissed. Several generals, prioritizing their troops' survival over Hitler's orders, authorized tactical withdrawals anyway. Hitler responded swiftly. By January 1942, he had dismissed or reassigned 35 generals. The purge sent an unmistakable message. Under Hitler's direct command, professional military judgment was subordinate to his orders regardless of battlefield reality. Among those dismissed were some of Germany's most capable commanders. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved for requesting permission to withdraw. General Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, was dismissed for pulling back to save his Panzer Corps from encirclement. General Hopner was not only dismissed but stripped of rank and pension for retreating without authorization. These were not incompetent officers. They were professionals who understood that preserving combat power sometimes required temporary withdrawal. But under Hitler's command, retreat for any reason was unacceptable. The dismissals established that Hitler valued obedience over competence. Officers learned that their careers depended on following orders, not on achieving military results. The purge had immediate effect on military culture. Officers who remained learned to avoid actions that might anger Hitler, even when those actions were operationally sound. Proposals for flexible defense were not presented. Intelligence suggesting operations should be modified was softened before reaching Hitler. A culture of telling Hitler what he wanted to hear began to replace professional military analysis. Junior officers noticed that advancement came from demonstrating loyalty to Hitler personally, not from tactical excellence. The institutional knowledge and professional judgment that made the German military effective were being systematically devalued. Within 2 months of assuming command, Hitler had fundamentally changed how the German military made decisions. The change was entirely negative. Hitler's direct command did not simplify German military structure. It complicated it catastrophically. The traditional Wehrmacht hierarchy still existed on paper, but now bypassed when Hitler chose. He also created alternative command channels through the SS, through personal favorites, and through Nazi Party officials. By 1942, Germany had multiple overlapping command structures, each claiming authority, none fully coordinating with others. The Wehrmacht controlled regular army operations. The Waffen-SS answered to Himmler but operated alongside Wehrmacht units. Party officials in occupied territories issued orders to military commanders in their regions. Hitler himself gave direct orders to individual units, overriding their chain of command. The result was organizational chaos. Field commanders often received conflicting orders from multiple sources. A Wehrmacht division might receive operational orders from Army Group headquarters, logistical directions from regional party officials, and direct tactical instructions from Hitler's headquarters. When these orders conflicted, officers had to decide which authority to obey. Choosing wrong could end a career. Smart officers learned to play competing authorities against each other, claiming to follow whichever order served their immediate needs. This created flexibility at the tactical level but destroyed strategic coherence. Units operated semi-independently, pursuing different objectives based on whose orders they chose to prioritize. Coordination between units broke down because there was no single authority directing overall operations. The SS-Wehrmacht split was particularly damaging. Waffen-SS units reported through Himmler's chain of command but operated in the same battle spaces as Wehrmacht forces. They received better equipment and prioritized political reliability over tactical training. Wehrmacht officers resented SS interference but lacked authority to command SS units. When operations required Wehrmacht and SS forces to coordinate, the process was clumsy and often failed. Meanwhile, Himmler actively undermined Wehrmacht authority, positioning the SS as the military force of the future. Hitler encouraged this rivalry, seeing it as preventing any single military organization from becoming too powerful. The strategic cost was enormous. Germany was fighting the Allies with a fractured command structure incapable of unified action. As Hitler assumed detailed operational control, military decision-making slowed to a crawl. Even minor tactical choices required his approval. Requests traveled up the chain of command to Hitler's headquarters. Hitler, preoccupied with multiple fronts and political matters, often took days to decide. Meanwhile, field commanders waited, unable to act without authorization. The Soviet and Allied forces moved freely, exploiting German paralysis. When Hitler finally issued orders, battlefield conditions had often changed, making his decisions obsolete before implementation. But officers could not modify Hitler's orders without risking dismissal. They implemented outdated plans, achieved poor results, and blamed circumstances beyond their control. The cycle repeated continuously. The paralysis was worse at operational level than tactical. Individual battalion or regimental commanders could still make immediate combat decisions. But anything involving divisional movement, strategic reserves, or resource allocation required Hitler's approval. This meant Germany could respond quickly to small-scale threats but moved agonizingly slowly in operational maneuver. Soviet commanders learned to exploit this. They would launch probing attacks that appeared significant. While German requests for reinforcements traveled to Hitler's headquarters and back, Soviet forces would shift to entirely different sectors. By the time Hitler authorized German counteractions, Soviet troops were attacking elsewhere. Germany's command structure was systematically too slow for modern mobile warfare. Hitler's personal involvement in minutiae made the problem worse. He did not just set strategic objectives. He specified which units would attack, what routes they would take, what objectives they would seize. He overruled local commanders on tactical details they understood better than he did. Officers learned their detailed tactical plans would be revised from headquarters, so they stopped developing careful plans. Why invest effort when Hitler would change everything anyway? The initiative and tactical excellence that characterized early German operations disappeared. Units waited for orders, followed them exactly even when circumstances suggested modification, and blamed failure on impossible orders. German military effectiveness was being destroyed not by enemy action but by its own command structure. By 1943, the problems with Hitler's direct command were obvious to everyone except Hitler. Operations were failing. Coordination was poor. Decision-making was slow. Professional officers attempted to convince Hitler to delegate operational authority while retaining strategic control. They proposed that he set overall objectives and let theater commanders determine execution. The proposals were carefully framed to preserve Hitler's supreme authority while restoring operational flexibility. Hitler rejected them all. He had convinced himself that only his personal involvement in details ensured proper execution. Delegation, he believed, would allow the professional officer corps to undermine his strategic vision through tactical timidity. He would not risk it. Hitler's refusal to delegate stemmed partly from distrust and partly from ego. He distrusted the professional military establishment, seeing them as conservative and lacking National Socialist commitment. He believed they would seek negotiated peace if given any independence. Equally important was his self-image. Hitler had studied military history obsessively since the 1920s. He convinced himself that his intuitive understanding of warfare exceeded that of trained professionals. Early victories in Poland and France, achieved partly despite Hitler's interference rather than because of it, reinforced this belief. He saw himself as a military genius whose insights must be imposed on every operation. Delegation would mean admitting he could not personally direct every battle. His ego would not permit that admission. The few officers who pressed the delegation argument were sidelined. General Halder, chief of the General Staff, repeatedly attempted to convince Hitler that operational details should be left to field commanders. In September 1942, after one particularly heated disagreement, Hitler dismissed Halder. His replacement, General Zeitzler, initially tried to establish clearer boundaries between strategic and operational authority. Hitler ignored these efforts. By 1944, senior officers understood that suggesting delegation was career suicide. The institutional mechanisms that might have reversed Hitler's command approach had been systematically eliminated. Germany would fight the rest of the war under a command structure everyone except Hitler recognized as dysfunctional. There was no mechanism to change it. Command dysfunction destroyed German intelligence effectiveness. Intelligence services still collected information. Agents reported from occupied territories. Signal intelligence intercepted enemy communications. Analysts produced assessments of Allied intentions and capabilities. But the intelligence system only worked if information reached decision-makers and influenced decisions. Under Hitler's command, intelligence that contradicted his plans was dismissed as defeatist or fabricated. Analysts learned to emphasize information Hitler wanted to hear and downplay contrary evidence. The result was that Hitler made decisions based on incomplete, filtered intelligence that reinforced his preconceptions. Germany was becoming blind to reality. The problem extended throughout the command chain. If Hitler rejected certain intelligence, subordinate commanders learned to reject it too. Intelligence suggesting operations should be modified was not passed to theater commanders because everyone knew Hitler would not accept it. Field commanders operated without crucial information their own intelligence services possessed. Meanwhile, officers developed their own informal intelligence networks, gathering information from sources they trusted personally. This created multiple parallel intelligence systems, each serving different parts of the fractured command structure. Some units had excellent local intelligence. Others operated nearly blind. There was no coherent picture of enemy capabilities or intentions at the strategic level. By 1944, German intelligence had become nearly useless for strategic planning. The Allies prepared the Normandy invasion under unprecedented secrecy and deception operations. German intelligence collected evidence of Allied preparations. Analysts correctly identified Normandy as the likely invasion point. Their assessments were presented to Hitler. He rejected them, insisting the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais where he believed it should logically occur. When Normandy was invaded, German forces were postured for the wrong location because intelligence had been overruled by Hitler's intuition. This pattern repeated across all fronts. Intelligence existed. It was not used. Command decisions were based on what Hitler believed, not on what evidence suggested. An army fighting blind will eventually lose no matter how brave its soldiers. German military doctrine had always emphasized operational flexibility. Mission-type orders gave subordinate commanders freedom to adapt plans to battlefield reality as long as they achieved overall objectives. This flexibility was Germany's greatest operational advantage in the early war. By 1943, it had been completely destroyed. Hitler's direct command imposed rigid operational plans that could not be modified without his authorization. Units were assigned specific objectives, routes, and timelines. Deviation, even when circumstances demanded it, was forbidden. German operations became predictable, inflexible, and easy for enemies to counter. The dynamic force that conquered France had become a plotting machine that telegraphed its intentions. Field commanders adapted by implementing orders minimally. If Hitler ordered an attack, they would attack with whatever forces were immediately available, regardless of whether those forces were sufficient. They would report that the attack was executed as ordered. When it failed due to insufficient resources, they would blame enemy strength rather than poor planning. This passive-aggressive compliance protected individual careers while ensuring operational failure. Officers would not take initiative because initiative could be punished. They would not adapt plans because adaptation required unauthorized decision-making. The result was a military executing orders it knew would fail, commanded by officers protecting themselves rather than accomplishing missions. The contrast with Allied operations was stark. By 1944, Allied commanders at division and corps level had significant authority to modify plans based on local conditions. They could call on reserves, shift axes of advance, and coordinate with adjacent units without referring every decision upward. Allied operations had flexibility that German operations lacked. When Allied plans encountered problems, commanders adapted. When German plans encountered problems, commanders requested instructions from Hitler and waited. The institutional advantage had reversed completely. Germany's command structure, once its greatest strength, had become its greatest vulnerability. The collapse was political and institutional before it became military. But the military consequences were devastating. Hitler's command destroyed German logistics. He made operational decisions without considering logistical feasibility. When staff officers raised supply concerns, he dismissed them as pessimism. The result was that German forces repeatedly received orders to conduct operations they could not logistically sustain. Units would advance until supplies ran out, then halt, having achieved nothing except exhausting logistics networks. Meanwhile, Hitler's competing command structures meant supplies were allocated through multiple channels. Wehrmacht logistics officers managed army supplies. SS units received priority allocations through Himmler's system. Party officials in occupied territories controlled local resources. The lack of unified logistics command created constant shortages even when supplies existed. The competing commands also meant transportation was allocated inefficiently. Trains would carry SS supplies while Wehrmacht units waited for transport. Roads would be clogged with multiple competing convoys. Storage depots were duplicated because different organizations would not share facilities. Germany, with fewer resources than the Allies, was wasting what it had through organizational chaos. Professional logistics officers understood the problem perfectly. They proposed unified logistics command under professional management. Hitler refused. He saw logistics as a detail that should not constrain operations. Officers learned not to raise logistics concerns because Hitler would simply order them to find a way. They stopped planning realistically and started promising the impossible. By late 1944, German logistics had collapsed in many sectors. Not because supplies did not exist, but because the command structure could not deliver them efficiently. Units operated at partial strength because replacement troops were routed through inefficient channels. Ammunition shortages occurred while depots held adequate stocks misallocated to wrong units. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks while competing commands hoarded fuel for operations that never materialized. The logistics breakdown was a direct consequence of command structure collapse. A unified command could have managed Germany's declining resources effectively. The fractured command structure ensured that even available resources were wasted. German forces fought the last year of war materially weaker than necessary because their own command structure prevented efficient resource use. By the summer of 1944, Germany's command structure had reached a point where recovery was impossible. The institutional knowledge that enabled effective military operations had been systematically destroyed. Officers who understood professional military planning had been dismissed, sidelined, or learned to stay quiet. The culture of professional military excellence had been replaced by political loyalty. Decision-making was completely centralized in Hitler, who refused to delegate and rejected advice. Multiple competing command structures operated independently. Intelligence was filtered to confirm preconceptions. Logistics were chaotic. Operations were rigid and predictable. The German military machine was not just losing battles. It was organizationally incapable of winning them. The July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler was partly motivated by recognition of this command collapse. The officers involved understood Germany was losing not just because of enemy superiority but because its own leadership structure had failed. They believed that killing Hitler and establishing professional military government might salvage something from the disaster. The attempt failed. Hitler's response made the command situation even worse. He purged thousands of officers suspected of disloyalty. The Gestapo and SS gained more authority over military personnel. Political reliability became more important than military competence. The few remaining professional officers who might have restored some functionality were removed. After July 20, any remaining possibility of command structure recovery was gone. What made the situation irreversible was not just Hitler's continued survival but the destruction of institutional capacity. Even if Hitler had delegated authority at this point, there were not enough capable officers remaining to exercise it effectively. The professional military culture that took decades to build had been demolished in 3 years. Replacing it would take another decade Germany did not have. The competing command structures were too entrenched to merge. Personal rivalries were too bitter to overcome. The habits of avoiding initiative and filtering intelligence were too ingrained to reverse quickly. Germany would fight the last 10 months of war with a command structure everyone knew was dysfunctional. But the institutional capability to fix it no longer existed. The collapse was complete and permanent. The command structure collapse manifested most clearly in operational failures during 1944 and 1945. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive in June 1944, destroyed German Army Group Center. The disaster was directly caused by command dysfunction. Hitler had ordered units to hold positions despite encirclement threats. Field commanders could not withdraw without his authorization. When they requested permission, Hitler delayed decisions. By the time he authorized withdrawals, Soviet forces had already completed encirclements. Entire divisions surrendered because the command structure could not respond to operational reality with adequate speed. 28 German divisions were destroyed, not because they were militarily inferior but because command paralysis prevented effective response. In the West, the Normandy campaign revealed similar patterns. German forces in France were split between Wehrmacht and SS commands that poorly coordinated. Hitler controlled strategic reserves personally, releasing them too slowly and in insufficient concentrations. Field commanders could not maneuver freely because operational decisions required Hitler's approval from East Prussia. Meanwhile, Rommel and von Rundstedt, the senior commanders in France, had overlapping authorities and disagreed on strategy. Neither could impose unity of command because Hitler played them against each other. The result was that German forces responded to Allied invasion with disjointed, uncoordinated efforts that Allies defeated piecemeal. The defeat in France was as much organizational as military. By 1945, command dysfunction was so severe that German forces often could not coordinate operations between adjacent units. Corps commanders issued orders countermanded by army commanders. Army group orders were overridden by Hitler directly. SS units operated independently of Wehrmacht forces beside them. Some units fought effectively in isolation, but there was no coherent operational plan at any level. The Allies advanced against determined but uncoordinated resistance. Individual German units would fight skillfully. Overall German operations were chaotic. The final campaigns of the war showed an army that had lost the ability to function as an army. It had become a collection of separate units, each fighting its own battle, connected only by the fact they wore the same uniform. Command structure collapse was complete. Command collapse at operational level translated to strategic incoherence. By late 1944, Germany had no unified strategy. Hitler's headquarters pursued one set of priorities. Wehrmacht commands had different assessments. SS leadership advocated separate approaches. Economic officials pushed competing resource allocations. Party officials in occupied territories implemented contradictory policies. No single entity coordinated these efforts into coherent strategy. Germany was conducting multiple separate wars simultaneously, each undermining the others. Resources committed to one priority were unavailable for others. Operations in one theater created problems in others. There was no strategic planning in any meaningful sense. Only reactive responses to immediate crises. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 exemplified this strategic incoherence. Hitler ordered concentration of Germany's last mobile reserves for an offensive in the West. The goal was to split Allied forces and capture supplies. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were preparing massive offensives in the East. Professional military staff argued that reserves should be positioned to counter Soviet threats. Hitler rejected this advice, insisting the West was more important. The Ardennes offensive achieved initial surprise but failed strategically. When it ended, German reserves were exhausted just as Soviet offensives began. Germany had no capacity to resist in the East because resources had been committed to a failed operation in the West. This was not strategy. It was strategic suicide driven by command dysfunction. In the final months, strategic incoherence became total. Hitler issued orders for offensives with forces that no longer existed. He planned defenses of positions already overrun. He allocated resources to units that had been destroyed. Field commanders implemented orders they knew were impossible because there was no mechanism to tell Hitler the truth. The fantasy and reality operated in separate spheres. Hitler believed Germany was still fighting effectively. Field commanders knew the war was lost. The gap between the two could not be bridged because the command structure had no institutional means for reality to influence planning. Germany's strategic position collapsed not gradually but in sudden complete failure once the accumulated dysfunction could no longer be hidden. The command structure had destroyed itself long before the final surrender. The command structure collapse had devastating human consequences. German soldiers fought bravely throughout the war. Individual units often performed exceptionally even in hopeless situations. But they were failed by their leadership structure. Soldiers died holding positions that should have been evacuated. Units were destroyed in encirclements that competent command could have prevented. Offensives were launched with insufficient forces because political considerations overrode military judgment. The waste of German military lives from 1942 to 1945 was enormous. Not waste in the sense of losses during combat, but waste through unnecessary losses caused by command dysfunction. Professional military leadership could have preserved combat power, traded space for time, and managed defeats to minimize casualties. Hitler's command did the opposite. The most tragic casualties were those suffered after the war was clearly lost. By January 1945, professional military officers understood Germany could not win. Continuing the fight only increased casualties without changing the outcome. Several senior officers attempted to convince Hitler to seek terms or at least authorize surrenders in hopeless situations. Hitler refused. He ordered continued resistance regardless of cost. Units were destroyed defending positions with no strategic value. Cities were leveled fighting delays that achieved nothing except civilian deaths. German military casualties in the final 4 months of war exceeded casualties in many entire years of fighting. These deaths accomplished nothing except satisfying Hitler's demand that Germany fight to complete destruction. The command structure that could not win the war also could not end it responsibly. The officer corps bore particular tragedy. Professional military officers had dedicated careers to serving Germany. Many had personal reservations about Nazi ideology but served out of patriotic duty and professional tradition. They watched their professional institution destroyed by political interference. They saw their troops wasted through command incompetence. They recognized the disaster unfolding but lacked authority to prevent it. Some resisted and were executed. Some complied and lived with guilt. Some simply did their duty day by day, following orders they knew were wrong because the alternative was abandoning their soldiers. The psychological and moral burden on German officers in the final years was immense. They were trapped in a system that had failed, unable to fix it, yet responsible for its consequences. After the war, captured German officers were extensively debriefed by Allied intelligence. The interrogations revealed the extent of command structure collapse. Officers described in detail how Hitler's interference destroyed operational effectiveness. They documented the competing command hierarchies. They explained how political considerations overrode military judgment. They provided examples of specific operations that failed due to command dysfunction. The testimony was remarkably consistent across hundreds of officers. Germany had lost not primarily because of material inferiority, though that was certainly a factor, but because its command structure became incapable of effective military operations. The institutional collapse was so severe that even German officers, many still bitter about defeat, acknowledged it. Historical analysis in subsequent decades confirmed these assessments. Historians examining German war records found systematic patterns of command failure. Decisions made for political reasons without regard for military feasibility. Operations launched without adequate logistics. Intelligence ignored when it contradicted preconceptions. Talented officers dismissed for providing unwelcome advice. Competing organizations undermining each other. The evidence was overwhelming. German military performance declined sharply after Hitler assumed direct command in December 1941. The decline was not gradual but stepped. Each major command change made things worse. The correlation between political interference and military failure was undeniable. Professional historians, including many Germans examining their own history, concluded that command structure collapse was a primary cause of German defeat. The lessons were studied by militaries worldwide. How does political interference destroy military effectiveness? How do centralized command structures create paralysis? How do competing organizational hierarchies undermine coordination? What institutional protections preserve professional military judgment? The German experience became a case study in how not to organize military command. Modern military doctrine emphasizes delegation, unified command, protection of professional military advice from political interference, and institutional mechanisms for testing strategic assumptions. These principles were not new. The Prussian military tradition understood them. Hitler's regime demonstrated what happens when they are abandoned. The German command collapse was preventable. That made it all the more tragic. Germany destroyed its own military effectiveness through avoidable political decisions. The collapse of German command offers timeless lessons about institutional leadership. First, centralization of authority beyond individual capacity creates systematic failure. One person, regardless of intelligence, cannot effectively manage operations of continental scale. Modern organizations require delegation and distributed decision-making. Hitler's refusal to delegate did not make German command more efficient. It made it paralyzed. Second, political interference in professional judgment destroys organizational effectiveness. Militaries, corporations, and institutions function through accumulated expertise and proven procedures. When political considerations consistently override professional analysis, the organization loses capability to accomplish its mission. Germany's military excellence was built over decades. Political interference destroyed it in 3 years. Third, competing power structures within single organizations guarantee dysfunction. Hitler's strategy of playing institutions against each other prevented any single organization from threatening him politically. But it also prevented effective coordination. Organizations cannot function efficiently when internal rivals are undermining each other. Unity of command is not just military doctrine. It is organizational necessity. Fourth, filtering information to confirm leadership preconceptions creates strategic blindness. Intelligence exists to provide accurate assessment of reality. When intelligence that contradicts expectations is dismissed, organizations lose ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Hitler's demand for confirming information rather than accurate information made German strategic planning increasingly divorced from reality. These failures are not unique to military organizations. They appear wherever institutional structures collapse under political pressure. Fifth, institutional knowledge is difficult to build and easy to destroy. German military excellence in 1939 represented decades of professional development. The officer corps embodied generations of tactical and operational expertise. Hitler destroyed this institutional capacity in 3 years through dismissals, interference, and political loyalty requirements. Rebuilding would take decades Germany did not have. Modern organizations face similar risks. Institutional knowledge resides in people and professional culture. When people are dismissed for political reasons and professional culture is replaced by loyalty culture, organizations lose capability that cannot be quickly restored. The German command collapse was a case study in institutional self-destruction. The mechanisms of collapse are visible in the historical record. The same mechanisms appear in failing organizations today. The lessons remain relevant. Germany did not have to destroy its command structure. Alternative paths existed. After the December 1941 crisis, Hitler could have appointed a professional commander-in-chief while retaining political authority. He could have established clear boundaries between strategic direction and operational execution. He could have maintained unified command under professional leadership. These alternatives were proposed by senior officers. They were not adopted because Hitler would not share authority. The tragedy is that German military effectiveness could have been preserved while still pursuing Hitler's strategic objectives. Professional command structure and political leadership are not incompatible. They require only clear delineation of responsibilities and mutual respect for separate spheres of authority. Even after Hitler assumed command, partial recovery was possible for several years. If Hitler had delegated operational authority while retaining strategic control, much damage could have been repaired. If competing command structures had been unified under professional leadership, coordination could have been restored. If intelligence had been protected from political filtering, strategic blindness could have been corrected. The opportunities for course correction existed through 1943. They required Hitler to recognize his command approach was failing and accept institutional reform. He never did. His ego and distrust of professional military prevented any meaningful delegation. The alternative paths existed. Hitler would not take them. German officers who recognized this faced an impossible choice: serve a failing system or abandon their posts and their soldiers. The historical question is whether military professionals should have resisted more effectively. Some did resist, culminating in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. They were executed. Others continued serving, hoping to minimize damage and preserve some combat capability. They were complicit in continuing a failed system. There is no comfortable moral position. Professional military officers are trained to obey civilian authority. When that authority is incompetent and destructive, professional ethics conflict with practical reality. The German officer corps struggled with this dilemma throughout the war. Most chose to continue serving, rationalizing that abandoning their posts would only make things worse. Whether that choice was correct remains debated. What is clear is that the command structure collapse created ethical dilemmas for which military training provided no answers. Germany lost World War II for many reasons. Allied industrial superiority. Strategic errors like invading Russia. Fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. But among the crucial factors was the political collapse of German command structure. This was self-inflicted damage. Germany destroyed its own military effectiveness through political decisions that prioritized control over competence. Hitler's assumption of direct command, his refusal to delegate, the competing power structures, the suppression of professional military advice, the filtering of intelligence, the politicization of military decisions, these were choices. They could have been avoided. They were not inevitable consequences of Nazi ideology. They were specific decisions made by specific people that had catastrophic consequences. The German military in 1939 was among the most effective fighting forces in history. The same military in 1945 was organizationally incapable of basic command functions. This deterioration was not caused by enemy action. It was caused by internal political collapse of command structures. Germany defeated itself before the Allies finished the job. The tragedy for German soldiers was that they fought bravely and skillfully under increasingly dysfunctional leadership. The tragedy for Germany was that the destruction was unnecessary. Professional military leadership existed and could have been used. It was deliberately set aside for political reasons. The cost was millions of lives and total defeat. The historical judgment is clear. Hitler's assumption of direct military command and the subsequent collapse of professional command structures was among the most consequential German mistakes of the war. It transformed potential military setbacks into catastrophic defeats. It made strategic adaptation impossible. It wasted Germany's military strengths and magnified its weaknesses. No amount of individual soldier courage or tactical skill could compensate for systematic command failure at the highest levels. The German experience stands as permanent warning. Political interference that destroys institutional professional judgment guarantees organizational failure. The mechanisms are visible. The consequences are predictable. The lessons are timeless. Germany learned them at the cost of total defeat.